Hey everybody, we are again looking at the power of the papacy. We began week 13 talking about why the really from 1100 to 1300 AD is considered by some to be the power of Catholicism, and what we are looking at in this video is a continuation of that. There's one other thing that we want to mention before we get to the end. I'll turn my volume down a little bit. There's one thing that we want to mention before we get to the end of this section, and that concerns a statement made by a pope after Innocent III's time that sort of sums up in a way how really by 1300 the pope and maybe some of the others looked at the pope himself. Maybe a reiteration of what's said before, but there's a little bit more weight to it now, considering of all the things that Innocent III had done, all the reaches into other nations and things of that nature that he was able to carry out as Pope. And this Pope was Boniface III. We may mention him a little bit later on. But he gives this quote towards the end of the 14th century. And the quote is this, and you don't have to write this down, but I may leave it up there for a minute for you to read and think about. So his quote is, "One sword must be under the other, and temporal authority must be subject to the spiritual. Therefore, if earthly power strays from the right path, it is to be judged by the spiritual. But if the supreme authority strays, it can only be judged by God and not by humans. We further declare, affirm, and define that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that all human creatures be under the Roman pontiff." And so the quote there that is of interest to us is obviously probably there in the middle. If an earthly power strays from the right path, it is to be judged by the spiritual. That could be a reference to a king being judged by a pope or another official, church official, right? That expectation is there, is what Boniface III is saying. But then the phrase right after that's obviously interesting as well. If the supreme spiritual authority, which is a reference to the Pope, strays, it can be only judged by God and not by humans. So the only person that the Pope has to answer for is to God, right? So the expectation at this point, at least from Boniface III, was that the Pope had a right to get involved with all of these things. He's doing what his designed role is, and then it's not the kings of other nations' right to question the decisions of the Pope. That's sort of what's being put off there by Boniface III. And so that sort of is given after the time of Innocent III. So it's something that in a way sort of sums up the legacy of Innocent III. It sums up the way that people viewed the papacy at that time, which if it's that powerful, it obviously marks a golden age in that sense for the papacy. We also talk about scholasticism, or religious learning. This is a golden time period for it as well. The 12th and the 13th centuries sort of mark the high point in a way, at least. A lot of people think about the Middle Ages, and it's called the Dark Ages, but in some ways it wasn't. So one thing that you see develop is that there's a growth of cathedral schools. That's one of the things that the popes are pushing for is more centers of education connected to the cathedral. Obviously, we talked about the universities, the Dominicans and the Franciscans, and how they got involved within that. This is the same time period when you begin to see multiple degrees being given out, and you see the sort of the early predecessors to a bachelor's, a master's, a PhD, a doctorate degree. This is when that whole system develops at the time, which obviously has relevance to us today. There's also a renewed interest in a Greek philosopher named Aristotle. Again, this goes back to the work of Muslim scholars who had preserved a lot of these works that during the Middle Ages, and especially the latter Middle Ages, more Europeans are going to be reintroduced to the works of some of these men. And Aristotle is one of those individuals as well. And we won't talk too much about how it affects religious thought, because there's a lot of deeper stuff we could get involved with we don't really have time to talk about. But Aristotle, in a lot of ways in his philosophy, as compared to Plato, Aristotle believed you could trust the senses. Plato, in a nutshell, in a lot of ways, was sort of the opposite. To a certain degree, you can't trust the senses. Aristotle held on to the idea you could trust the senses. And the point that this opens up within Aristotle is that people begin to focus on direct observation of the existence of God. And so really what Aristotle does in some ways, he's forbidden in some circles because there are some that take Aristotle's ideas and really shape Christianity, or at least shape Catholicism at that time in a very different direction. And so in some places Aristotle was banned, but what the focus on Aristotle does is that it begins to open up ideas about the relationship between scientific reason and faith. And that becomes important when we talk about the Renaissance connected to week 14. It's obviously going to play a role next semester and possibly in the final semester as well. Certainly we know the ongoing debates between science and religion, right? And so what Aristotle does in some ways is that, those questions about what is the relationship between human reason and faith in God, there's sort of, the door begins to be opened. Another thing that Aristotle helps introduce is if you're observing things based on the senses, in a way this is sort of a precursor to the development of the scientific method, which becomes important not in this class but in the next class when we talk about the ideas of the Enlightenment and some of the relationship between science and religion at that time. We'll talk about that more in the next class. There are a couple of men, we don't have time to talk about these two individuals in particular, but you may have heard of both of these, Thomas Aquinas and Albert the Great. This is the same time in which they lived, and a lot of their work is recorded, all in connection to this high mark in religious learning, which again marks part of the golden age of Catholicism. When it came to missionary efforts as well, this is when, again, you see an outgrowth in work in terms of trying to spread the gospel, or really Catholicism is spreading. With the Franciscans, you've got some that are establishing works in Spain, North Africa. They obviously are going to be a lot different than the Crusaders. They're not trying to convert people by the sword, but we keep in mind the Franciscans and the Dominicans had a particular focus on poverty and living the lifestyle of a beggar, and they open up missions, and they become a lot more successful in terms of converting, and they lead the way in this. There was a Franciscan named John, who, again, you've got his name there on the screen, of Monte Corvino, and John actually traveled to a lot of different places. He went to Persia, India, Ethiopia. He even went all the way to Beijing. In fact, the first, if I'm not mistaken, he becomes the first archbishop in Beijing, which, again, is all the way over in eastern China. The Franciscans, too, I don't have that up there, but the Franciscans are actually going to become, at this time, the largest missionary body in the Middle East, in Palestine. So the largest presence of the church, reference to Catholicism, is in large part going to be these Franciscan missionaries which have settled in that region. It sort of foreshadows again how Franciscan missionaries are going to lead the way in taking Catholicism to a lot of the western, the southwestern United States and Central America. Raymond Lull is another guy, or another individual. He's not connected with them, with either one of the schools, but he actually develops a school that was primarily geared towards learning Arabic and all the other Eastern languages as a way to train people to be able to go in to take the gospel to some of these areas, or at least to spread Catholicism to those areas, we should say. The Dominicans, they worked primarily in Tripoli in Spain. They primarily worked with Muslims and Jews. And then again, they went about their work about the same way as the Franciscans did. There were some efforts to convert by force. You have one group of people, they're called the Teutonic Knights, who primarily tried to convert along the Baltic coast. And at this time, the Baltic coast, you still have some pagan groups in that area, which is why there's a conversion by force, a little bit different than how the Franciscans and Dominicans were treating the Jews and the Muslims. And I'm going to pull up a map here. See if I can pull up a map here of about the time period that this is. I can just point out where well, that map's not going to work. I was going to point out just where the Baltic coast is if you're not familiar with the geography there. That was the same map. Let's try that one. Yeah, okay. So this may not be able to really lay out the way, but the Teutonic Knights are primarily located in here. When I talk about the Baltic, the countries today, if you looked on a map, you've got Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. I believe are the three countries that are along in this area. But it's sort of west of Russia, northeast of Poland, this area. At this point, there's still apparently a presence of pagans here, not Christians, not Jews, not Muslims. The Teutonic soldiers carried that same crusading spirit and used force to convert people up in this area at the same time. And so you see growth continuing, at least in that way, forced conversion. And you've got Russian expansion as well. At this point, this map doesn't record it, but during the 1300s, you have the Mongols, I should say, that a very southern accent there, the Mongols, who essentially are coming over from Asia. You may have heard of the name Genghis Khan, one of the most well-known conquerors in the history of mankind. He and his, I believe his sons, expanded the Mongol Empire all the way over into Western Europe, or over on the border with Western Europe, which meant that they took Russia as well. And it's around this time that Russia begins to overthrow. By the end of this time period, it's the same time when Russia begins to overthrow the Mongols, and part of uniting Russia into a modern state is going to be using Christianity as a means of doing that. And the Russians will use the Orthodox Church. They're not Catholic, but they would use the Orthodox Church. And today the main body, the main denomination of Christianity associated with Russia is the Orthodox Church. And we may talk some more about that as we move on. Also want to talk about, there's some developments too with how churches are being built. The church building being built sort of develops too. And we'll look at a couple of pictures in a minute. We've heard this before. I think hopefully you've heard this before, that the church is more than a building, which is obviously true, right? The church is made up of the people that God has added to the church, right? People that have obeyed the gospel. So the church represents the people. Well, at this time, the church building in some ways was a very special building. It was more than just a building to a lot of people. And so one of the ways in which this was true is the fact that it was a place of learning for a lot of people. Keep in mind that at this point, you don't have a lot of books. It's obviously hard to obtain one, very expensive to do that. A lot of people could not read because they didn't have access to education to learn how to read. And so this is a place where people were taught. A lot of people, we take for granted the fact that we have Bibles, we can read it ourselves. But for a lot of people then, the only way that they were taught was being there at the building and hearing a priest read out scripture or something like that. There were also, this also could be said that some people saw the building as a place of miracles. Not that miracles were actually taking place in there, but if you think about the idea again of transubstantiation, which we've talked about before, where it's said that the body and that the bread, the unleavened bread and the fruit of the vine literally become the body and blood of Christ. Now, obviously, if that were to happen and if that were true, that would obviously be a miracle. But for some people, the church building held a special place, right? It was seen in connection with that special things happen there, as evident by transubstantiation. A lot of times is evident by this being a place where people were baptized. So maybe this is where people began to think that the church building was very important, because obviously there are people that think that today. Maybe not directly, but indirectly may think that today. For a moment, I want to look at a few architectural styles connected with it. So you've got what are called Romanesque churches, and I will pull up a picture of it, at least one. And I'm going to point out some things. You don't have to write down all these notes about the style, but these are just some things that I sort of find interesting about it. All right, let me get oriented with where I am at on Google Earth. So one thing about Romanesque churches is that the basilica sort of changes, at least in the way that it's laid out. And I want to see if I can get an overview. Yeah, that'll work. If I can zoom in right there on this. It looks like as far as we can go. All right, so, let me tell you what, let me pull up this bigger map. That way I'm not so much in the way there. So if you're looking at this church, one thing that you begin to see happen is that the basilica, which is this part right here, it begins to more look like a cross if you look at it from the top. Beforehand, generally the basilica looked like an uppercase T, right? So you've got that horizontal line that's at the very top of the vertical line. Apparently, the way that they began to build basilicas is a little bit different, is that it looked more like a cross or a lowercase t, because you can sort of see the horizontal part, at least, is moved down further from this top. And that's something that develops. It may not catch your eye real quick, but that is a development I wanted to point out. Another thing that is interesting about the way that they were built is that they were primarily made up of stone. The roofs were primarily stone as well. You can sort of see, again, there are archways connected with it. But if you notice, though, there are very little windows in these types of church buildings. Again, you see a little bit of windows. You see a small window there, maybe some small ones there. But you notice that they don't have a lot of windows, so you don't have a lot of light either that comes into these church buildings. And this is the way that they have been building, at least at this point. These are called Romanesque churches. It was at this time that churches began to add in a bell tower as well. So if you think about a medieval church, you think about generally you think about a bell, maybe as a way to call people to a meeting. And some churches today, some early churches in the United States, they had bells. Well, it was at this time period in a lot of these Romanesque churches that you began to see what is called a belfry, which is just a reference to a bell tower being constructed. And I believe the bell tower, I assume the bell tower is here up top. But that's sort of the beginnings of it. However, there began to be a transition in the way that churches were built. and they began to be built in the style of what we know today to be Gothic churches, and this is probably what we think of when we think about a medieval church. And that is this, by the way, was the Basilica, the St. Vincent Basilica, which is in Avila, France. This is going to be a Gothic church that was built in that was Avila, Spain. This is going to be a Gothic. The next one we're looking at is a Gothic cathedral that was built in Seville, Spain. And you're going to notice that there are several differences here. See if we can get one back up where we can look. So obviously, if you think about the Gothic style, you think about points. Yeah, I'm pretty sure this is it. So obviously, you think about a Gothic style, you think about the points, the spires or the points, right? That are part of that architecture, and you can see it there. Let me back up and get a little bit better. Try to get a little bit better picture of it. Trying to get one from the road, that way it's a little bit farther back. Maybe you could, yeah. So you can kind of see the spires, right? The looks to be pointed arrows up the top. This is when these type of churches began to be built, and this is probably, if we think about a church in the Middle Ages, this is probably what we're thinking about. The archways are more pointed now. So if you go back to that Romanesque church, generally the arches look like a circle right on the end. But if you note, like for instance here, I don't know if I can zoom in, if you note there, the arch actually comes more to a point. And that's a style that's distinct of Gothic churches. Another thing that is distinct, at least on the outside, there's some things that we could talk about on the inside, but we kind of need to move along. I will mention one thing. All right, so see if we can zoom in some more. All right, so something else that's sort of distinctive about the time period, at least the architecture, if you see right here, you've got these sort of look like I don't know what you would call it, but extensions or something of that nature. They're technically called flying buttresses, and they are pretty distinctive of churches that were Gothic in nature, at least how they were built. And what's characteristic is obviously these extensions that you see all across, and if you look over, you see them all across the tops of buildings. I don't do anything with construction. I'm not exactly sure if that was built so much for style or if that was actually for part of the structure, at least help maintaining the structure. But again, this is when your typical middle-aged church, if you think about it in those big cities, that's sort of what it looked like, excuse me. Right? You've got all of those points that are there. So that in a nutshell sort of sums up why this is the golden age. You got Catholicism really at the height of its power. You think about the style of building that we just talked about here, the typical church of the Middle Ages that sort of characterized and was in a lot of ways the jewel of a city. It looks like it did. It's reached what we often remember it looking like in that sense. This is the height of scholasticism. This is the height of the church continuing to spread throughout Europe through regular conversion. But all of a sudden, it begins to decline. Catholicism begins to, it doesn't decline in the sense that it goes away, but the height that it reached obviously begins to decline. And we want to talk about a few reasons why that is the case. And first of all, we're going to talk about really three main things in this section. One, we're going to talk about the challenges to papal power that are in some ways, coming outside of the church. Then we're going to talk about the connection between the papacy and France, and this is very important now. It also helps explain later on sort of the development of Christianity in the United States as well. And then we're going to talk about the Great Western Schism, which is going to again involve the papacy. But these three things are going to be very important to talk about how Catholicism began to slip away from that height, beginning at the end of the beginning during the 1300s. All right, so a few things we want to point out. There are some signs of deterioration during the Golden Age. Obviously, the decline. You're going to see signs of the decline during the height of anything, and that's true here with the Golden Age of Christianity. We know that with the Fourth Crusade, we've mentioned this before, that the Pope essentially had his ally placed on the throne in Constantinople. Well, by 1261, the Pope and his ally have lost control of the city. So what it represented was the union that had supposedly developed by the Pope putting his man on the throne in Constantinople. That unity between the Orthodox and the Catholic Church is completely gone. And it shows really that it was not genuine. And so from the 13 to 1400s on, you're going to see problems become more evident. And one of those problems in particular is nationalism, the rise of nationalism. We'll see how that plays a role in a moment. We're also going to talk about, too, the bubonic plague, which is probably obviously in human history, probably the largest epidemic ever in terms of the number of people killed, but one of the most notable events that happens at this time in history. So with the rise of nationalism, we know that nationalism is essentially, again, patriotic feeling, the love of one's country. And this becomes important as we see moving forward, because people are going to start thinking about themselves in connection with their nation, more so than with their other identities. Another thing that's connected with the rise of nationalism is the influence of the world economy. All right, so this is important to understand. Let me pull that back up, put it that way. All right, there we go. All right, so the influence of the world economy. We discussed before that a byproduct of the Crusades was that there is an increase in trade, that the cities continue to develop and people continue to move towards cities. So as a result of this increased trade, there's a growing class of people that emerge that are becoming wealthy pretty quickly. And this is a merchant class. Sorry, there we go. It's a merchant class. It's called the bourgeoisie. And if you can't spell that, I've got that up there. It's a difficult word to spell. The bourgeoisie, they are not the nobility. They're not nobles in that sense. They're not dukes or barons or whatever middle-aged title of nobility you could hold. They're not kings. They're just this new class of people that have become rather wealthy because of the growth of trade. And so, as a result, the bourgeoisie and the nobility went head-to-head against each other a lot in terms of their spheres of influence. Because here's the deal, the nobility, generally, they tended to start wars that were often petty in nature, that may not need to be fought, in which war, a lot of times it disrupts trade, especially if it's two groups of people that were once friendly with another that have suddenly become hostile. That's not good for trade. At the same time, you've got nobility who would often tax imported goods for their own benefit, right? And so both of those things hurt trade. And so the bourgeoisie wanted really a strong centralized government or a monarchy to curb the power of the nobility to protect their own financial interest. And so when it came to the kings also had a problem with the nobility, because for a lot of kings, sometimes the nobles in their land didn't have to obey them if the king could not muster a powerful enough army to threaten them to abide by the rules or to abide by what they wanted, so to say. And so the bourgeoisie, on the other hand, because they're this growing class of people that are at odds with the nobility, and the king who's at odds with the nobility, it's one of those cases where the enemy, or the friend of my enemy, or I won't mess that up. I'm just going to leave it at that. The kings and the nobility, they form an alliance together because they have a common enemy. The bourgeoisie, because of the wealth they're bringing in, this gives the king, by allying with the king, this gives the king more resources to utilize to try to control the nobility. And so you have a natural alliance that develops because of this. This is when bankers and merchants begin to grow in power. And as we think about a modern economy, you maybe see some early traces of it developing because of the power that merchants and bankers are going to have because of the alliance with the king. But what this really does, the growth of a stronger centralized monarchy, you see the development of nations as we know them, modern nations. So France, England, you're no longer calling them the Franks anymore. You're no longer calling them the Angles or the Saxons or whatever tribe they were. You're starting to think about England as England. You're starting to think about the Franks as the French, France. And some of these nations develop quickly. England, France, Norway, Sweden, they kind of do pretty quickly. Germany and Italy, that identity's still there, but unifying as a single nation doesn't come till much later. So you have that. You've got the influence of the world economy there. And so with the development of the nation, obviously that is connected to nationalism, right? And the importance within that is that national identity becomes more important than local identity. So whereas people might have thought to themselves that at the end of the day they are Parisians if they're from Paris, or maybe they are Londoners if they're from London, instead people are going to most identify with, I'm a I'm a Frenchman, a French woman, I'm from France, or I'm English. Because I'm from England, not because I'm from London, but the main identity is I'm English because I'm from England, and not a Londoner because I'm from London. Same way, right? If I'm in the Germanic territories, I'm a German. If I'm in Italy, I'm an Italian. Spain, I'm Spanish. So you've got that idea that is present there. The idea that the national identity becomes more important than the local identity. And even in nations that don't develop quickly, like Germany and Italy, you've got things that are thought to be German, you've got things that are thought to be Italian. So what the byproduct of that is that sometimes one's identity with the nation triumphed over their own identity as a Christian, which is, I think, it can be a problem for maybe some of us today, but it was a problem that began to be developed then. People thought of themselves maybe, obviously most people at that time were under the umbrella of the Catholic Church, but if they thought about what separated them, what made them unique, it was what nation they were from. And sometimes the problem was that identity triumphed over the identity of that mindset is what could be at least in some cases then was very much problematic, because people were trying to identify themselves more, placing more emphasis on being from a particular nation rather than on being united in Christ. So one of the results of that byproduct is the 100 Years' War, which lasted more than 100 years, but from 1337 to 1475 AD, you've got a war that primarily involves England and France. Again, we've seen Christians we've seen so far that there have been cases where Christians had no problem attacking people that were heretics or non-Christians, but you've got people that are in good standing within the Catholic Church at the time that are again fighting one another. And this war, again, just is representative of nationalistic impulses, right? So the setting behind the war, we're not going to go into detail about it, but essentially the King of England, he claimed the throne of France. The King of France at the time was his cousin. England, so you've got England and France, but England also decided to invade Scotland, which is just north of England on a map. And the result is that the French get involved. The French were allied with the people of Scotland, so that naturally leads to a war. Sorry. The English generally held the advantage early on. Did not have a lot of funds to compete with to be able to take control of the territories that they conquered, so they had to retreat in a lot of cases. There was a French king that took the throne. His name was Charles VI. You don't have to get that name down, but he showed signs of madness, and this led to a civil war within France. And it looked like England, who was obviously backing the side that was going to support them, looks like they were going to be successful and take the throne of France. But enters in one of the more important characters in the history of the Middle Age time period is Joan of Arc. So Charles VI's son, Charles VII, he is in the city of Orleans, which is where we get New Orleans from. Just like there's a city in Britain named York, where we get New York. Same deal with New Orleans. Charles VII, he is in Orleans. He's besieged. Many of his father's former enemies who came to his side after his father had died were there to help him, but it looked like everything was pretty bleak. When supposedly he hears about, Charles VII hears about this woman that's having visions of leading his army into the city to break the siege and take the king to the city of, I believe it's pronounced Reims, which is where the French king would be crowned. And she was successful in doing this. She lifted the siege. She's taken the king to Reims. He is crowned as king at that point, and it's sort of seen as a turning point in the 100 Years' War that benefits the French. Later on, after that event, she's actually betrayed by the king that she helped, and she's sold to English bishops who try her as a witch and a heretic, and she's ultimately burned at the stake. But in the nation of France, Joan of Arc is one of the more popular figures. If you study French history, you're going to come across Joan of Arc. She's a lot of times remembered as a national hero for what she did here. But in all, what you see from this war, and the most important thing is you start to see those nationalistic impulses come to the surface in terms of nations that claim to be following the same man, claim to be part of the same church, in a way, begin to start fighting one another, right, and start killing one another. And you start to see how the nationalistic impulses are going to undermine the Pope's authority. We'll talk more about that in a minute when we talk about the papacy in France. All right, so likewise, you have that event. We also want to talk about the bubonic plague, or the Black Death, or is sometimes called the Great Plague. So there are a couple of factors that sort of led to the development of this plague, or made it so widespread. All right, so you have what some historians have called the Little Ice Age, and obviously there are people that connect that with a larger ice age, and we don't have time to go into all of that, but I just use the Little Ice Age because that's what historians have labeled it. But obviously, as you might could tell, at this time you've got at least the course of a year or maybe a couple of years, you've got it's colder than what it normally should be, right? You've got a cold spell for a couple of years. And so what happens is that you don't have nearly as much agricultural production, right? And so if you don't have as much agricultural production, you don't have enough food. It means people are going to go hungry. And generally famines help aid in terms of diseases, because if you can't properly if you can't provide the proper nutrients to your body, obviously you're gonna your immune system's not going to be as good as it should be. All right, so you have that factors into it. Famine, weak immune system. You also have the fact that trade increases between Northern Europe and the Mediterranean, which helps it spread more. And that is because the Spaniards begin to drive out the Muslims in Spain. They take control of what's known as the Straits of Gibraltar. And I'll pull that up on a map. Or at least pull that up on Google Earth. Actually, no, I'm going to back out for a minute. Pull that up there. Okay, so here are the Straits of Gibraltar, which, again, if you take control of this, the importance of this is that, right, so you've got the Mediterranean Sea over here, and there's no direct outlet. There's no direct outlet to Northern Europe, at least trading by sea, unless, because obviously you can't get to Denmark from here right by boat because it's land up there. So the only way that you could get there by trading is actually go through the Straits of Gibraltar and sail around and go up there. So technically, if you control this territory, you basically can control trade between the Middle East or the Mediterranean and Northern Europe. So it's important to hold that. Well, once Spanish Christians gain, I'm using that term loosely, I emphasize that. Right, once they gain control of this territory from the Muslims, it opens up more trade. And so diseases are going to, what spreads with trade a lot of times, at least in that time period, was obviously disease as well. So those are the two big major factors that lead to it. So the way that the disease essentially worked is that it came from fleas. Fleas carried it. Fleas that were found on rats. The rats, in a lot of ways, carried the fleas, and so there are a lot of people that connected the disease to rats, but it was really the fleas on the rats. And so if you got bit by a flea or something like that, obviously you were infected with that disease. The symptoms with it, obviously you got fever loss, you've got loss of balance, and this is a general progression right here. You got, again, right, you develop a fever, you develop a loss of balance, generally your lymph nodes are swollen, and in some cases there are signs of dementia, and generally for most people within 5 days at that time, people died. I don't have the date up here, but this is 1348 to 1350. If you want to get that down, 1348 to 1350 is the date. Most died within 5 days of contracting or coming into contact with the disease. Again, with its spread, it's thought to have originated either along the Black Sea or in Mongolia. Yeah, I've got time. I'll just pull that up on the map real quick. See if Google Earth pulls up for me. If it doesn't, there we go. All right, so don't mean to make that blurry. The Black Sea is right, this area right here. So it's thought to have come from somewhere in this region or farther east, towards what is modern day Mongolia, which is farther to the east. And we'll run low on time, so we'll look at the go back to the PowerPoint. So again, because of trade, it spreads from that area. It goes to Italy, it goes to Northern Europe, and so through trade it spreads. Approximately, we're told 1/3 of Europe dies from the disease. approximately one-third of Europe dies from the disease. Obviously a lot of million people die. So a very deadly disease. The consequences are important. Now, obviously, you've got economic turmoil, you've got disruption in trade, political turmoil connected with that, but you also begin to see increased skepticism concerning God and superstition as well. So, for instance, some religious scholars began to question the way that God works. Some increasingly put out the idea, the question, does God even work anymore? Or does God have a completely detached, is he completely detached from the universe and just allows it to happen? Or that's the question that some religious scholars were posing, which would help explain why you have this deadly disease that's killing a lot of these people, including Christians, right? So, some people began to question, how does God work? What is his role in the universe? And people are going to continue to question that, obviously. You also see some that began to fall more into superstition, take up some superstitious habits. The plague, in a lot of ways, encouraged superstition, and these are a couple of. This is one way in which this happened. So the Pope had actually, I believe it was in the 1200s, the Pope had actually forbid the sale of relics. And what happened with the Black Plague is, what's revealed is that there was, in a way, a black market of trading for relics. And the idea is that if you own, if you owned certain relics, that the relics would protect you from the disease, which we know that not to be the case, but that's at least what some people thought. If you buy a certain relic or whatever it may be, if it's connected to apostle, if it's even connected to Jesus or the cross, an important relic would keep you protected from contracting the plague. Obviously, that wasn't true. You also see people begin to make more pilgrimage to holy sites as a way to protect themselves from the disease. And we know that really didn't do anything at all in terms of protection. There was also more anti-Semitism that results from this, especially on the part from Christians expressing anti-Semitism or hatred towards Judaism. So the reason why this happened is because the bubonic plague or the Black Death, it didn't affect Jewish households as much. And I don't think historians are exactly sure why. There are a number of ideas out there. One idea that's out there is because that a lot of Jewish families actually owned cats, which obviously ate the rats, which ate the fleas, and kept people from getting bit, which would obviously decrease the spread of the disease within Jewish communities. Christians at the time period generally didn't have cats because a cat was associated with witchcraft, which we still maybe see that to a certain extent in terms of how we associate a lot of times a black cat with bad luck, or sometimes we associate a black cat with witches today, maybe connected with Halloween. Well, that really goes all the way back to the Middle Ages. That's why some Christians blame Jews for the plague because they weren't affected as much by that. Perhaps maybe because they did have more cats that ate the rats that carried the fleas. Some Christians suggested that some Christians who saw that the Jewish households were not as affected as much, some Christians accused Jews of going and poisoning the wells of other Christians, which wasn't true. It's actually interesting to note that the Pope actually tries to stop a lot of the violence that Christians level at the Jews, because the Pope recognized that a lot of the allegations were completely unfounded. But that's one of the consequences of the bubonic plague, is that furthered Christian anti-Semitism in that way. So all of those things are negative events, and they're not going to help Catholicism at all. And then one final thing, and this concerns the Byzantine Empire. It doesn't concern Catholicism, but it doesn't concern the impact of Christianity, at least the Orthodox Church at the time. So the plague, obviously, it encouraged the empire to weaken. For all of the reasons that we've mentioned with Catholicism, that was the case. So the Turks continued to attack from the west. We talked about that with the Crusades. The Seljuk Turks continued to attack, had attacked Constantinople, had moved further west to attack Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire. There's another group of Turks that arise known as the Ottoman Turks, the Ottoman, Ottoman, Ottoman. They're another group of Turks that arise. They, again, continue to attack Constantinople. And in the process of this, a lot of the other churches of the East that are important, so like Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, they break ranks with Constantinople, which essentially leaves that city defenseless. And so by 1453, the Byzantine Empire comes to an end because the city of Constantinople is taken. It's renamed Istanbul, and it becomes the capital of, later it becomes the capital of the Ottoman Empire, which the Ottoman Empire would exist all the way up till the end of World War I. And so you think about 1,000 years earlier, Constantine came to this city with the idea of making it into a Christian Rome. Well, a little bit over 1,000 years later, Constantine's vision of this beautiful city dedicated to God is now gone. It's come to an end. It's in the hands of the Ottoman Turks. And so that's one thing that we'll look at. That's one thing to keep in mind. We'll cover the next two in the next lecture video, but we're going to go ahead and stop our thoughts. We're going to stop the lecture here. But again, thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention.